was fond of saying that our people are just the now people. They want everything now. If you tell them something for later, I ain't got no time for later. I want it now. Capitalism makes you think that everything must come now. But the struggle in which you're involved in is the struggle in which you will not reap that which you've sown. You have already reaped that which has been sown by past generations. You must sow for future generations to reap. I'm so tired of brothers and sisters coming and saying, when we go enjoy the good life? It ain't for you, it's for the next generation. Do your work now for the next generation. When you work for your people, it's not what you receive, it's what you give. And the best thing about working for the people is that what you really give for the people, sometimes nobody else knows except you. This is real struggle for the people. This is real struggle for the people. Thus we must wipe out from our minds that the struggle in which we're involved in is going to give us any victories. The struggle in which we're involved in is an eternal struggle. We are not working for ourselves, we are working for generations to come. Therefore, what I've done, you ain't even begin to see. Generations later will come to thank us for the work we've done now.
See your babies, como so baba, yes, Warmest greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. The Pan-African People's Phone-In is a space for themed interactive discussions over the airwaves, in fact in cyberspace, because we're not actually on the airwaves as such, but we're in cyberspace. It's really an on-air workshop. That's what the Pan-African People's Phone-In is. It's an opportunity to share specific parts of our history over the airwaves. We're looking particularly at the strategies of some of our greats. But in general, we're looking at issues, whether historical or contemporary, that impact on African people's experiences locally and globally. Now, from time to time, the Pan-African People's Phone-In will have guests. I mean, that's not the case for now. We're going to work with the workshops for now. But from time to time, that will happen. And when it does happen, you can expect revolutionary Pan-Africanist guests. That's the first thing. But you can also expect non-African guests from time to time. But all guests will be invited to contribute on the basis of issues which are pertinent and relevant to African people. And when there are guests in the second half of the program, listeners will be invited to ring in, ask questions and contribute. But because we're working in the workshop format at the moment, the line is an open line. So, you can ring in essentially at any point during the program to speak on an issue which has been presented, from the book that we're actually following, and of course you'll be able to ring in for the libation corner also. So we ask that you please spread the word. Tell all of your family, friends, fellow organisation members, colleagues, associates, and other networks about this show. Let them know that the program is happening every Monday from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. So I want to say a warm greetings to all of the people who are connected with the Pan-African People's Phone-In. That's all of the listeners. And I know that there are aspiring listeners. I hope increasingly those aspiring listeners are able to make the connection. But people who have tried to make the connection technicalities have perhaps got in the way. But hopefully people are getting over those kinds of barriers now. So welcome to you as a listener, whether you have overcome that barrier or are still in the process of doing so. I want to say a warm good evening to our engineers. Our engineers who, behind the scenes, are working to ensure that technically the program reaches the appropriate standard and allows you, the listeners, to be able to connect and hear. Not just hear, actually, participate if you choose to participate. I want to wish a warm good evening to the station's management. Again, they provide the infrastructure that allows us to come together in this way so that we can dialogue, if we choose to, over the internet. And of course, I want to say a warm good evening to my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio. I'm thinking in particular, after this program, our brother Astamari, comes and does his program. So I want to say a warm welcome and good evening to our brother Astamari, who you should be hearing a little bit later. I'm thinking of Lady Leo and the great work she does on a Friday. I'm thinking also of let me see, of our brother Dougie, who does some brilliant work, not just on the program, but in the community. Lady Leo too, of course. Some excellent work on the radio and in the community. We've got our brother Jegna, another of the brothers doing work in the community as well. I had a conversation this week with our brother Jammers, who is doing a lot of work in the community also. So there are many people, presenters on Blessed Radio, who don't just come to present, but actually contribute to helping to advance our community. So I want to wish a warm good evening, whether your name has been specifically mentioned or not. I want to wish a warm good evening to my colleagues here, the presenters on Blessed Radio. Now, at the top of the show, I give out the phone number. The phone number, should you decide that you want to interact. Now, it's always good to make a note of the phone number. I'll give it out in just a moment. It's always good to make a note of the phone number, to just have it on record, just in case you decide that you want to ring in and interact. And the number for interaction, the studio number for interaction, is 079 444 313 66. That's 079 444 313 66. Again, I ask you to write that number down. If you have a paper and pencil, program it into your phone. That's probably the easiest way to have it available. Or just to document it by whatever means works for you, whatever your favorite means of documenting these this type of information is. It will facilitate your participation in the program. I mean, as the program goes on, I'll probably forget to give out the number, and it can be very frustrating if you want to make a contribution and you don't actually have the number. So I'm going to give it out once more here at the top of the program to allow people the opportunity. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to grab your pen and paper or whatever it is that you use. And the number for interaction is 079 444 313 66. Now, the way the workshops have been working is we have been working from the book Pan-Africanism, from Program to Philosophy. I have it in my hand at the moment. I'm pointing in the direction, I think, of one of the cameras in the studio. So if anybody wants to get a sense of the book, I think the programs go up on YouTube almost immediately after they're finished. So somewhere on YouTube, our technical people will have to brief me on that. Somewhere on YouTube, you'll be able to get a sense of this book. You can order it online. Also, if you decide that you want to follow along with the actual text that we're using, you can get copies from Lady Leo has copies. I think Sister Legette, I'm talking about people local in the Tottenham area, has also has copies. I'm sure that there are other other bookshops, etc., that will have copies. So the book is called Pan-Africanism, from Program to Philosophy, subtitled An Outlook on Liberation. So I encourage people who want to follow along with what we're reading to have that book available. At the moment we're on chapter 3 of that book. We've looked at a kind of general approach to Pan-Africanist strategy. we've looked more specifically at the strategy of Marcus Garvey. We are now on chapter 3, where we're looking at the strategy of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. And it should become clear that Kwame Nkrumah's strategy is actually built upon Marcus Garvey's strategy. You'll see a lot of commonality between the two. So what was happening was Nkrumah wasn't trying to replace Garvey's strategy. He analysed it and found that it was still appropriate in his time. And I would personally argue it's still appropriate now in this time. And what he did is he built on Garvey's strategy. He took it further. He brought Garvey's strategy to the motherland, to our home. You know, very, very, very important. And he also raised the level of it, ideologically and philosophically. He actually raised the level of the strategy. We won't be looking at that specifically, but, books like Conscientism, that's a book written by the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, now encapsulates African philosophy as it is appropriate for the liberation of our motherland from colonialism. So, it's a massive contribution that the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah actually makes. But just to give you an overview of the book, each week I give this overview of the book. It's on the back of the book if you've got it for yourself. And it reads as follows. Pan-Africanism from Programme to Philosophy is the only book in the world to provide clear, lucid and simple explanations of the liberation strategies of Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X. Historians have been naturally concerned with reporting facts of the lives of these great Pan-Africanists, but it is for activists to contextualize them in liberation strategies and action plans, a process kick-started in this book. 1. It provides a clear, succinct explanation of international capitalism's parasitical dependence upon African people. 2. It provides a clear, simple explanation of scientific socialism, relating it to African principles and culture. 3. It introduces the notion of the greater cycle of revolution, which examines and locates revolution not as an incident, but as a process in the context of the entirety of human history. 4. Through an examination of universal principles, it locates the material base of the two opposing sets of ideologies, driving human activity, and identifies the natural position of African culture in that milieu. And finally, 5. Through a newly devised set of dialectical tools, it provides a powerfully clear philosophical analysis of matter as a basis for uncovering and understanding the universal laws required for Africa's liberation. Pan-Africanism from Programme to Philosophy is a long overdue and much needed sourcebook on the theory of Pan-Africanism. For people new to Pan-Africanist activism, or those who simply want to understand what Pan-Africanism is, this book provides clear theoretical guidance. For seasoned cadre and veterans of the Pan-Africanist movement, it is a checkpoint, frame of reference for assessing, orientating, or even refocusing the trajectory of their activities. Ideally, it should be studied collectively in groups, particularly those working genuinely towards the liberation of Africa and her people in the context of worldwide revolution. So that's just an overview of this book, Pan-Africanism from Programme to Philosophy. And we will be continuing with section or chapter 3 of that book. I think right now what we can do is we can move to the Libation Corner.
Ever since you went away, I have been doing nothing but.
So this is the Libation Corner. This is the section of the program where we honor our ancestors and the historical liberation achievements of our ancestors. Now, you can contribute to the Libation Corner in one of three ways. Firstly, if you have a loved one that has recently passed, we invite you to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged during the Libation Corner. Secondly, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then again we invite you to ring in and have that loved one acknowledged right here in the Libation Corner. And thirdly, if there's an African historical anniversary that all of us should be remembering at this time, then once again, you're most welcome to ring in and have that African historical anniversary acknowledged, and of course the ancestors who participated in that anniversary, again right here in the Libation Corner. So the number for the Libation Corner is 079 444 313 66. I'll repeat, 079 444 313 66. And what I will do is I will share some libations, you're free to ring in whilst I'm sharing the libations. All that will happen is that I will stop, allow you to make your contribution, your libation, and then after you've completed your contribution, I will resume the libations that I'm making. So today is the 10th of February. That's the 10th of February 2020. And we'll start our libations on the 11th of February, and we'll go back to the year 1890, 130 years ago. Because 130 years ago, tomorrow, one of our ancestors, F.J. Farrell, patented the steam trap. That sounds very interesting, doesn't it? The steam trap. Because you can harness a lot of power if you can trap steam, expanding water. If you can harness that power, in fact, what you have is explosive power. And if you can harness that, you have a lot of power which you can use to create forces that you can then direct to your advantage. So this kind of deep science was being worked on by our ancestors to the extent that our ancestors could actually patent it. So F.J. Farrell, we remember you. And moving to the 12th, that is the 12th of February, and this time we go back to the year 1793. because on the 12th of February 1793, the U.S. State and Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. You see, we were so busy running away or getting away from enslavement. We were so busy fighting enslavement in every way that we could. They had to pass acts to criminalize our natural desire to be free. So you had people like Harriet Tubman, for instance, organizing the Underground Railroad in order to assist fellow African people to be free. And the enemy responded with laws like the Fugitive Slave Act, calling us criminals for getting away from its criminal enslavement of us. Such is the confusion in the minds of the European imperialist enemy. So we remember our ancestors, those who got away. We remember our ancestors, some of whom didn't actually get away, but nonetheless made attempts to get away. And if they didn't make attempts to get away, they made attempts to resist. But the bottom line of this is that we never, ever accepted enslavement as something which was natural to us. And moving on now to the 14th. The 14th of February, going back to the year 1817. That was the day when one of our freedom fighters by the name of Frederick Douglass was born. Frederick Douglass is a giant figure in African history. You'll remember that Marcus Garvey named one of the ships in the Black Star Line after Frederick Douglass. Such was the giant stature of this man. African History Month, which in 1926 started as something called Negro History Week in February, was put there because that was his birthday. So African History Month is actually, in part in its history, in honor of Frederick Douglass. Such was his the greatness of his contribution. So we need to remember this giant who fought for us politically, actually, in the arena of discussion. Yes, there are physical wars, but there are also diplomatic elements to wars. And he was one of our leaders in the diplomatic element to the which led to the abolition of slavery, for instance, in U.S. Satan. Moving on to the 15th. That's the 15th of February, going back just not that far actually to the year 1972. And we remember Woodard G. Dudley, who patented rapidly crystallizing vinylidene. Now, that sounds interesting, and I, in truth, I don't know what vinylidene is, but it's got the word vinyl in it, so it gives us a sense that it was, that his specialism was in the area of plastics, that he was at the cutting edge of plastic technology. So we remember Woodard G. Dudley. And the final contribution that I'll be making in the Libation Corner this week will be to remember another of our ancestors, by the name of P. Walker, because P. Walker patented a machine for cleaning seed cotton. So we've got to understand the significance of this, that during enslavement in the Caribbean, we were forced into the fields to produce sugar. In US Satan, we were forced into the fields to produce cotton, so that, Europeans could have shirts, dresses, bed sheets, etc., etc. All of those kinds of things, and being forced into that kind of situation also meant that we had to think about what we were doing, and so it's quite natural that developments in cotton and the production of cotton should fall within the natural remit of African invention. We were forced there, and of course we were not happy to be forced there, but even in those circumstances we were able to invent.
In Ohio, and I miss you, baby. Lord knows I do. You look at my eyes and see that a great big man like me has been. Oh Lord, sitting in my lonely room, filled with nothing but gloom, and I've been a dying baby. Oh Lord, because ever since the day you left, I don't know what to do with myself. All on my hands and knees wishing for your return. And oh, how I yearn. And I miss you, I miss you. I miss you, baby. Lord knows I do. I miss you, baby. I really miss you. I said I miss you, baby. I said I miss you, 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 baby. I just can't do without you.
So that brings the libation corner to a close for this week, and we will now move into the literature that we are discussing together. And you'll remember that we were discussing Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah and his strategy for the liberation of Africa, and we're continuing with that. We've now reached section 3.5, Ghanaian independence. Ghanaian independence, the catalyst for African unity. Now, we finished last week with a look at the African personality, and I think what I'll do is just very quickly, not in the same depth as last week, but just remind us of the African personality, because this is important to understanding our culture, actually. Understanding the African personality puts us in a position to better understand what it is the drivers are of our culture. And the African personality is driven by three basic principles. The first of those principles, and the cardinal principle of African culture, is humanism. That we put people before money. We put people before profits. We put people before property. People are the most important thing. This is the central principle of African culture. And we are important for no reason other than the fact that we're people. We don't need any more to be important. We are important precisely for that reason. So just having the gift of being a human being, having the gift of being born a human being, brings with it that innate dignity that all human beings are entitled to. This is African culture. This is the center of African culture. So we respect people. The second principle is the principle of collectivism. And collectivism in a nutshell is we before me. That the collective is superior to the individual. Not that the individual is not important. The individual is essential, as is the collective. They are both essential. But the collective is superior. Given that they're both essential, the collective is superior to the individual. And we can prove that in all kinds of ways. The collective lives longer than the individual. That's pretty obvious. You know, the collective makes the individual, but the individual can't make the collective. You put lots of individuals together, but individuals cannot create other individuals and cannot create the collective in the way that the collective, the right woman and man, coming together can create a new individual. So there are lots of just signs in nature that help us to understand that point. And the third principle of African culture is egalitarianism. This is the point that we are all equal in essence. We are all equal in our human essence. In African culture, we don't go for this superiority, inferiority nonsense. Because we know that all human beings are intrinsically valuable and all human beings are intrinsically equal. It doesn't matter that, you know, some have greater abilities than others. It doesn't matter that some people are disabled whilst others are non-disabled. You know, you are equal in the egalitarian sense just by being a human being. And so it's important to understand that because those three principles, humanism, collectivism, and egalitarianism, run through African culture, not just the African personality, but they run through African culture, and they are the standard by which we operate. That's our natural mode of operation. I'm not saying that you don't find Africans behaving differently, especially those of us exposed to this type of society, British, US, Satan, etc. types of societies. The influences in those societies have impacted on us, and you know, some of us behave in all kinds of strange ways. Even in Africa, the colonialism, slavery colonialism and neo-colonialism in Africa has impacted on sisters and brothers in Africa, and there are strange behaviours that go on. But when you look at African culture at its root, you'll find those three principles: humanism, collectivism, and egalitarianism. So, with that said, let me move on. 3.5, Ghanaian independence, the catalyst for African unity and liberation. Prior to the independence of Ghana, there were 7 independent states in Africa. They were Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia. Surprisingly, none of these states took the initiative of building a united framework of operation amongst themselves for directly working towards the liberation of other parts of the continent. It was not until after Ghana's independence in 1957 that Pan-Africanism moved to Africa, its real home. And Pan-African conferences were held for the first time on the soil of a liberated African state. So, well, I mean, we've got to understand this is a very significant point here. That there were nations that were independent. Ethiopia, technically, had never been colonized. In fact, when you look at the details, it's not as clear cut as that. But, technically, Ethiopia had never been colonized. But Ethiopia didn't take the initiative to call freedom fighters together to seek the liberation of the entire African continent. The Sudan became independent in 1956, a year before Ghana. But the Sudan did not, take that kind of initiative. So places in the north like Libya, etc., Egypt was another one. Those places were, they were independent. But it didn't seem to occur to leadership in those nations that they had to do something about freeing the rest of the continent. And if it did occur to them, they didn't take the actions necessary to achieve that. And it was only when Ghana became independent on the 6th of March 1957 that Nkrumah drove this agenda forward. So when Ghana became independent, the uniting and liberating process of African people took on an organized continental form. Nkrumah made his intentions clear from the outset. At 12:01 a.m., well, it wasn't 12:01, it was straight away after the midnight hour, but it was, approximately 12:01. His first act as president was to declare that, and I'm quoting Nkrumah, he says, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of the African continent." His words reverberated across the continent. Immediately, the beating drum sent a message across rivers, mountains, forests, and plains. The people heard and acted. Liberation movements gained strength, and freedom fighters began to train. One after another, new African states came into being. And above the world's horizon loomed the African personality. African statesmen went to United Nations. Africans stood up and spoke on the rostrum of the World Forum. And they spoke for Africans and the people of African descent everywhere they might be. Ghana was the launch pad for the full liberation of Africa, which brought the same tactical question encountered in the struggle to win Ghana itself. Do African people recover the continent militarily through armed struggle or diplomatically via moral persuasion? In the case of Ghana, it was diplomatically. Remember, we looked at positive action last week, and so that was diplomacy, so they used diplomatic techniques, they used diplomacy, they used positive action. But for the continent, Nkrumah pursued both. And by pursued both, we're not saying that he went into physical war as well as positive action, but he opened up both channels as possibilities in the future. So he did not close off either of the channels. He worked diplomatically, but he also worked with the freedom fighters in Africa, some of whom were at war already. So the Mau Mau was already at war, and you couldn't just ignore the fact that they were at war. You had to decide, are we going to support them or are we not going to support them? Algeria was already at war, and you couldn't just ignore that. Do you support them or do you ignore them? Yeah. In the Cameroon, you had what are they called? The Union of the People of Cameroons, UCP. They were in armed struggle. Again, these armed struggles could not just be ignored. And so Nkrumah opened up a diplomatic route, the peaceful route, if you can visualize it in those kind of terms, and set about organizing the freedom fighters, the people who were engaged in physical war, and the freedom fighters who were likely to be engaged in physical war soon as a result of pursuing their freedom. So he immediately set about creating diplomatic processes that would make this surge for African unity a reality. Out of these processes, 2 conferences emerged. The first, a conference of independent states, brought together all the African heads of states in existence at that point. Its purpose was to develop a plan aimed at freeing the remainder of the continent from colonial rule. The independent governments would spearhead the liberation process for the rest of the continent. Nkrumah understood that the onus is always on oppressed people to come together to free themselves, by force of arms if need be. He therefore convened a second conference, operating through mass grassroots organizations. The All African People's Conference was designed to put the African masses at the forefront of the struggle of African liberation. The result of these conferences was so powerful that in the years that followed, even those African leaders who for their own selfish reasons were personally against African unity felt obliged to publicly state their support for it. This two-pronged approach to African self-determination meant that under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana became widely acknowledged as the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism, i.e., the process for uniting and liberating Africa. Now that term is very important, the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism. We'll be looking at Malcolm X, maybe next week, maybe the week after, but we're coming to Malcolm X soon. And Malcolm X described Ghana under the leadership of Nkrumah as the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism. Those were the words, and you'll find those words, that description of Ghana and Nkrumah, you'll find that in Malcolm X's autobiography. I spoke to someone just this week who has bought Malcolm X's biography and is, in the process of going through it. And that's one of the things that I asked them to look for. You'll find it in there. Now, it's also important to note, as we're talking about Malcolm X, that when this drive for liberation happened in Africa, it also triggered drives for liberation among African people in other parts of the world. So as Africa began to rise in Africa, and Malcolm X says this actually, there are books of his speeches in them, as Africa began to rise, the pride of African people worldwide began to rise. And so you saw a rise in diasporan activity. You saw the civil rights movement developing very much around characters such as Martin Luther King, for instance, one of the leading figures. This was all on the back of the rising pride of African people. We could now hold our heads up high as we were beginning to experience this process of independence. Malcolm X, you see him shoot to the forefront when he talks about the ballot or the bullet. He's dealing with the question here that Nkrumah is dealing with. Do we go for the ballot, the diplomatic route, to getting our freedom? Or do we go for the bullet, the war route, to getting our our freedom, because we're going to get our freedom. It's a matter of tactics how we get it, but we're going to get our freedom. And so, Malcolm X comes to the fore. In his aftermath, the Black Panthers come to the fore. So all of this, the activity that's happening in Africa is like a litmus paper. It's a torch. It's lighting up Africans around the world as we hold our heads up high in pride. Moving on to the next section, 3.6. Build a continental-wide nation-state diplomatically. And section 3.61, state-level unity, a diplomatic offensive. Held in Accra, Ghana, the first conference of independent African states was attended by the 8 independent African states plus 2 African liberation organizations in combat. The Union of Cameroonian Peoples and the National Liberation Front of Algeria. So let me just explain that you had these 2 groups who were literally at war in their parts of the continent. And the independent nations decided to allow them to participate in the Conference of Independent States as nations. So the freedom fighters sent their representatives to the conference to be a part of it. Now, both of these organizations were in the midst of pitch military battles to free their parts of the continent from imperialism. The conference ran from the 15th to the 22nd of April 1958. And the first day of the conference was the 15th. The first day of the conference, the 15th of April, was declared by the delegates present Africa Freedom Day. So the 15th of April was Africa Freedom Day. That would later change to African Liberation Day, and that would become the 25th of May. And maybe as we read on, we will come to the explanation as to why that happened. So this Freedom Fighters Conference was the first conference to set down a day, African Freedom Day, for us to look carefully at our at the progress of our liberation efforts, the progress of our liberation struggle. Reading on. This is the first occasion that the day was set aside by African people to reflect on the progress that was being made towards the total unification and liberation of Africa and her people. The purpose was to mark the first occasion in modern history when independent African states met to plan the liberation process for colonized nations in Africa. It also symbolized the determination of peoples of Africa to free themselves from foreign domination and exploitation. Previous Pan-African conferences, conventions and congresses were held abroad. This conference meant that Pan-Africanism had finally taken root in African soil. Let me just make this point very quickly. That this conference, the Freedom Fighters Conference, was really the 6th Pan-African Congress. There is another event which comes later in 1974 which bears that name. But that name is actually not genuine. I'm expressing a view here based on the history. Is not genuine. The genuine 6th Pan-African Congress, and it was the first All African People's Congress. Now, it's not immediately clear why they didn't just call it the 6th Pan-African Congress, but because it had moved home, may have been the reason. So the Congress was now on African soil, and it was all African. Another of the distinctions was Arab nations. I say Arab nations, but parts of Africa dominated by Arabs were included. And that might be one of the reasons for using the term all African rather than Pan-African. The details have not necessarily, well, if they're clearly expressed in the history, I haven't found it clearly expressed. And so I'm having to reason my way through the available information. But certainly, this was the Sixth Pan-African Congress. We know that because W.E.B. Du Bois tells us that it was conceived as the Sixth Pan-African Congress, but quite why it was changed to the First All-African People's Conference has not been, at least to my knowledge, clearly articulated. We're left to do some speculation in that direction. Reading on. The eight African countries at the founding of Africa Freedom Day understood that only a unified and liberated Africa could free Africans. Kwame Nkrumah, in his welcoming address, set the scene. Let me just take a step back here, because I've conflated two conferences here. We are discussing the Conference of Independent African States. And I apologize, but I've just discussed some of the history of the All-African People's Conference, which was the Sixth Pan-African Congress. So the one I'm discussing, the Conference of Independent African States, was not the Sixth Pan-African Congress. It was the Freedom Fighters Conference, which we will come to shortly. But anyway, the opening speech was given by Kwame Nkrumah at the Conference of Independent African States. And he says, "Today we are one. If in the past the Sahara has divided us, now it unites us. And an injury to one is an injury to all of us. From this conference must go out a new message. Hands off Africa. Africa must be free." The Arabs on the continent were an integral part of the African liberation struggle. Since the external manifestation of European capitalism seeks to dominate Africa, the conference had to be anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and anti-neo-colonialist. It was also, of course, anti-settler colonialist. Each of these evils are manifestations of an economic system that comes from foreign European countries. Countries that have and are exploiting Africa's resources and labour for profit. The purpose of these exploiting systems is to enrich a few Europeans and the African puppet leadership that supports those Europeans in Africa. Building on the experiences of Ghana, the main strategy adopted by Pan-Africanists to free Africa from foreign domination was positive action, which involved campaigns in the form of boycotts, strikes, and the vote. Pan-Africanism, the next section is 3.62, Pan-Africanism comes home, freedom fighters at the ready. So this conference, the Freedom Fighters Conference, was the real Sixth Pan-African Congress. Pan-Africanism returned home in the form of the All-African People's Conference held on the 8th to the 13th of December 1958, also in Accra. It brought together freedom fighters from all over Africa in a united effort aimed at achieving African liberation. At the time, these freedom fighters were largely unknown outside their immediate spheres of operation. However, many of them were to go on to become leaders, presidents and prime ministers in the wind of change as independence within national borders, it should be noted, swept across Africa. Among the 300 delegates representing the entire continent and the African diaspora were Patrice Lumumba, Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, Tom Mboya, Oginga Odinga, Joshua Nkomo, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Congressman Charles Diggs, W. Alpheus Horton, George Padmore, Franz Fanon. Remember, there were 300 freedom fighters here. These are some of the giants of that period. Now, I have to say that I've mentioned Tom Mboya, who was at that time recognized as one of the giants of Pan-Africanism. But I do have to report that Tom Mboya was later found to be on the payroll of the CIA, which disqualifies him, turns him effectively into an agent of the enemy. So he received payments from the CIA. He says, these are his words, he says that he did not knowingly take payments from the CIA. So let's give him his opportunity. He denies it. But I think in more recent times the evidence has become overwhelming, and it's become clear that he did receive payments from the CIA, and to that extent, at minimum, he was an agent of the CIA. Carrying on, the conference reaffirmed the resolution of the Conference of Independent African States by calling on all African countries and all friends of Africa throughout the world to observe Africa Freedom Day as a rallying point for the forces of freedom. It went further than the first Conference of Independent African States by resolving that, where necessary, armed struggle should be employed as a means for liberating the African continent from imperialist domination. Understand this. So the conference, the Freedom Fighters Conference, the governmental conference, the Independent States Conference, didn't make this kind of statement. They were not prepared to go to war. But the Freedom Fighter Conference said, look, we are making a resolution that says that if we feel that we have to fight militarily to free our land, then we will do so. So there was it was far more radical than the Conference of Independent States. It was resolved that the All African People's Conference in Accra declares its full support for all freedom, all fighters of freedom in Africa. To all those who resort to peaceful means of non-violence and civil disobedience, as well as those who are compelled to retaliate against violence to attain national independence and freedom for the people. Where such retaliation becomes necessary, the conference condemns all legislation which considers those who fight for their independence as common criminals. A powerful statement in support of liberation wars to free our land. And notice, this is not about being bloodthirsty. What the resolution says is, they want to do peaceful means, but if it becomes necessary, the freedom fighters will have to pick up their guns and go to war. So, peaceful means are what we really wanted. That's what our ancestors really wanted. But in the background always lurked the possibility that we'd have to pick up arms because the people who are stealing from us don't want to give up the goodies. Continuing. If the first Conference of Independent African States represented the coming home of Pan-Africanism, then the All-African People's Conference, by officially adopting Pan-Africanism as its objective, represented the grounding of Pan-Africanism firmly within the grassroots of the African liberation struggle. Now, notice, the All African People's Conference, this is the Freedom Fighters Conference, adopts Pan-Africanism as its objective. Notice that it adopts Pan-Africanism as its objective. So this is consistent with it being the 6th Pan-African Congress. So we can see that event was really the 6th Pan-African Congress, and it raises question marks about the event that is more widely known as the 6th Pan-African Congress in history. Because that event, which was held in 1974, came 2 years after the death of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. And it seemed to change the direction of Pan-Africanism. It was a retrograde step, in fact, for Pan-Africanism, the 5th Pan-African Congress being the highlight that led to independence, and the All African People's Conferences which kept that momentum going until they stopped in 1962. Nkrumah summarized the importance of the All African People's Conference in the following words. He says, "While this was primarily a conference of dependent peoples, a bridge has been built between freedom fighters throughout the continent. In other words, this conference has linked together the independent states with the dependent territories in a common front." So what you had was now, if you like, a mass organization which included the freedom fighters who were fighting for liberation in different parts of the continent. Remember, Robert Mugabe, for instance, was, not at this time, but soon afterwards, was living in Ghana, married a Ghanaian woman, his first wife, who's now with the ancestors, or went to the ancestors well before him, was actually a Ghanaian woman. So, the likes of Mandela, he was at the All African People's Conference. Now, you must remember that these are just little boys now in comparison to Nkrumah, but they would become the people who we think of as giants some decades later, although I would question the notion that Mandela was a giant, but that's another discussion for another time. Now, continuing, in the same year under the guidance of the Democratic Party of Guinea, PDG, the People's Republic of Guinea achieved independence. So this is 1958 that Guinea achieves independence. Now, Guinea, which had suffered under French colonialism, took on an active role in working towards continental unity and liberation. Ghana and Guinea combined to serve as an inspiration as well as a base for the Pan-African movement worldwide. So what happened is Ghana became independent under the leadership of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, and Guinea-Conakry became independent under the leadership of Ahmed Sékou Touré. Now, let me just say in relation to Guinea that there are 3 countries in Africa called Guinea. There is Guinea-Bissau, which is next door to Sékou Touré's Guinea-Conakry on the west coast of Africa. That's, in between, when you leave Senegal, you come to Guinea-Bissau, and the next country along is Guinea-Conakry. And then after that, you move on to, Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc., as you move along the coast. And then as you continue, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, you come to Ghana, you come to Togo, you come to Benin, you come to Nigeria, you come to the Cameroon, and as you continue round a little bit further and start to move south along the west coast of Africa, one of the countries you come to is called Equatorial Guinea. So there are 3 Guineas in Africa: Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea-Conakry. And so the Guinea that we are speaking about here, that became independent in 1958, is Guinea-Conakry, under the leadership of Ahmed Sékou Touré. And what then happens is Ghana and Guinea, in effect the 2 leading nations in Africa from the vantage point of seeking liberation, come together and form a pact. They form a nucleus, and that nucleus becomes what they hope will develop into a united Africa. So they were beginning the process of making Guinea and Ghana one nation. But it was difficult geographically because there were other nations in between. And some of the nations in between, like Ivory Coast, for instance, were making things difficult. Just a little bit more background here before we actually move on. Yeah. The French nations, in fact, that's the wrong language to use. The African nations colonized by France at this point, and we're talking about in 1958, when France realized that there was this kind of mad rush for independence in Africa, it realized that it was going to lose its holdings. It was going to lose the wealth that it was extracting from Africa. And it embarked on a number of different strategies in order to retain the French colonies under its control. So its objective was to hold the French colonies under its control. What it did is it assassinated African leaders in its colonial holdings that did not agree to come under the tutelage of France. So any African leader who was genuinely working towards the independence of their nation from France came under attack. Sékou Touré, of course, managed to survive, but not all of them did. So there are giants like Boganda, for instance, who was assassinated, and the reason for doing that was to send a clear message to leadership in Africa that if you don't do what France tells you to do, you will be killed. That's pretty powerful stuff when it comes to convincing people to work against the interest of their own people. Later, France would always also use coups, military coups, or coup d'etat against leaders that it didn't like. It was not alone in that department. Britain did it. US Satan did it. They were all the imperialists were all up to those kinds of tactics, and so coups were also used, and in that way they could keep people that they liked in power, and the people that they liked were the people that were going to do their bidding and damage their own people. So there was a strategy which France was adopting, and those were two parts of it: to kill, to organize coups was another part of it. The other thing that France did is France, when it created a climate of fear, then offered nations, African colonies, the opportunity to vote on whether to stay as a French colony or a new French colony, a neo-French colony, or to take the independence route. And they organised this, this vote in 1958, in that region. 59, in the region of 1959, and all of the nations, under the intimidation of France, voted to stay under the tutelage of France, with the exception of Sékou Touré under Guinea. And then what the French did, when Guinea, under the leadership of Sékou Touré, voted to leave French colonialism and become independent, they did many things. The first thing they did is they stripped everything that they said was theirs out of the country. And when I say everything, they even took the toilet seats out of the country, leaving the country destitute. So they just took everything and went. And so you had a nation with nothing, basically. And Ghana, under the leadership of Nkrumah, gave Guinea $10 million in order that it could begin some kind of process of recovery. The other thing that it did is because there was agitation when all of the others, so, one country voted to leave, but all of the others voted to stay. Yeah. What it then did is it embarked on a campaign of exploding nuclear bombs in Africa. Now let's be clear that France exploded nuclear bombs in Africa in the Sahara. This is a part of the history that's not spoken about very often. But they exploded nuclear bombs in Africa. They did this as part of the process of intimidation. This is what we can do to you if you try to leave French colonialism. And so they got the majority of their colonies to agree to vote for what they called the continuation of the colonial pact. By killing heads of state, assassinating heads of state and people in powerful positions that were against their interest, by organising coups, by giving this vote, which was not a genuine vote, and also by exploding nuclear bombs on our soil. I think they conducted 5 or 6 different what they call nuclear tests, which means that they exploded nuclear weapons on our soil in the Sahara. And they did it specifically in Algeria as well. And that was very important in the southern part of Algeria, which is kind of in the middle of Sahara. It was a message to the Algerian people that France has got nuclear weapons and can use them against them. But strategically in the middle of the Sahara, it was also in the middle of many of the French colonial territories to intimidate everyone of those presidents. And let me just say this, that when Sékou Touré and the people of Guinea voted to leave France, they didn't just strip it dry. They also tried to organise a coup against Sékou Touré, and the coup plot was discovered. And it was Houphouët-Boigny, who was the president of sorry, I take that back. It was Senghor, who was the president of Senegal. They found a shipment of arms, French arms, were found in Senegal, and the idea was it was found in Guinea actually, but it was shipped from Senegal, or across the interior of the Sahara part into Guinea Conakry for the purpose of military invasion and the ousting of Sekou Touré. It was discovered and the plot was defeated. But I'm just trying to show you some of the intrigues that were happening at that point, and the fight that was going on for independence. And that fight was being quelled by France on many levels. And we see the former ambassador for the United Nations, Ariana, I've forgotten her surname, the one that they sacked, for just speaking certain truths. She just told the truth about French colonialism. She told the truth about French imperialism in Africa. And the kinds of people that they have as heads of state are the lackeys of our enemy. And these lackeys gathered to sack her from her post. I think she was she became African of the Year. There was a vote where she became African of the Year for the great work that she did, going back now to, when was that? It's only last year, in fact, that she was putting out lots of videos, and we look forward to more of that information. So just to recap, in the same year, under the guidance of the Democratic Party of Guinea, that is the PDG, the People's Republic of Guinea achieved independence. Guinea, which had suffered under French colonialism, took on an active role in working towards continental unity and liberation. Ghana and Guinea combined to serve as an inspiration as well as a base for the African liberation movement worldwide. Moving on to 3.63, entitled Building Towards the OAU. From 1958 to 1963, the process of African independence intensified under the leadership of what became known as the Radical Casablanca grouping. Led by Nkrumah, this group sought the full political independence of the entire continent as one state. Through their efforts, the conditions had been created for the proliferation of independent African states, which numbered 32 by 1963. During this phase, a range of imperialist maneuvers aimed at controlling the direction of independent African nations were unleashed. Nkrumah explains, and let me quote Nkrumah here. The following is a quote from Nkrumah. He says, "Meanwhile, two groupings alike in content with similar policies were formed. One, the Monrovia Group, which met in Monrovia in May 1961, consisting mainly of English-speaking states whose loyalties were basically Anglo-American. And two, the Brazzaville Group, made up of French-speaking states mostly aligned to France. Both these groups adopted a go-slow attitude towards African emancipation and unity, and pursued a policy of conciliation with imperialism. Their views were expressed at the Lagos Conference in January 1962, when 20 of Africa's 28 independent states met to discuss ways in which cooperation could be achieved. They agreed that the absolute sovereignty and legality of each African state must be respected. Secondly, that the union of one state with another should be effected on a voluntary basis. Thirdly, that there should be non-interference in each other's affairs. Fourthly, political refugees from one state should not be given asylum in another state. Imperialism's diplomacy appears to have succeeded admirably in splitting up the independent states of Africa into separate and conflicting groups. The efforts of the militant Casablanca group were checked by the pro-imperialist bloc, which was in its turn subdivided into pro-French and pro-English branches. End quote of Nkrumah. Now, what we have here are three groups. The first group, and these are three African groups. The first group, the Casablanca group, is the group in which Ghana operates. Remember, Ghana was the state that was that spearheaded the liberation process for the entire continent. Yeah, so it was at the forefront. It was what Malcolm X called the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism. And as states became independent, the idea was that they would just join with that group, and that group would get bigger and bigger, eventually becoming one group, eventually becoming one continent. And when we reached the point of being one continent, we would be a powerhouse in the world. Nothing in the world would be able to match our power, and we would take our rightful place in the world, and Africa would develop at a colossal rate. That was the kind of simple plan that Nkrumah had. But then what happened is that the new nations, as they became independent, instead of joining with the genuine African freedom fighters, instead of joining with the leading nations, the Casablanca group of nations, what then happened is the French started to pull their group, the nations that they controlled, into something called the Brazzaville group. So then that Brazzaville group started to represent the interest of France. They were not representing Africa at all. They were actually held on a string, like puppets. And they began to represent the interest of France, and they started to attack the very nations who were responsible for creating the circumstances for them to become independent nations. And whilst they were doing that, another group developed, the Monrovia group. Monrovia is the capital of Liberia, named after a former US Satan president by the name of Monroe. And so US Satan had control over this part of this part of our motherland. And so Monrovia became like the headquarters for the English-speaking nation. So U.S. Satan, had its claws in a couple of countries, even though it was unofficial. And Britain had its claws, its colonial claws, in many African nations. And so they started to persuade the nations under their sphere of influence to argue against the original group that started the liberation process. And then what happens is the French controlled nations and the British and US Satan controlled nations, the puppet nations, then came together, creating a majority, 28 of them, against the 8 who were the genuine African freedom fighters. And so those 28 nations, rather than being grateful to, and when I say the nations, I don't mean the people, I'm talking about the corrupted leadership. Yeah, those 28 nations, rather than being grateful to the Casablanca group, which spearheaded the way for liberation, which created the circumstances for their parts of the continent to be liberated, rather than being grateful to them, what they did is they went and they started to do the licky business in relation to France for the Brazzaville group, it was France for the Brazzaville group, and Britain and US Satan for the Monrovia group. And so in that way, Africa became divided, irreconcilably divided, because the leaders in the Monrovia group and in the Brazzaville group, the leaders in those groups were basically beholden to the enemy, the colonial enemy, the imperialist enemy. They were serving the interests of the enemy against their own people. And so what was then happening is, in the background, US Satan, Britain and France were agreeing on policy of what would happen in relation to a united Africa. And of course, they don't want a united Africa. They want a divided Africa. Because a divided Africa, they can just go in and take our gold. They can go in, they can take our diamonds. They can go in, they can take our oil. They can go in, they can just take what they like. Whilst we're divided, because each individual part of Africa is too weak to fight off those nations. We're only strong enough to fight off those nations when we come together as one. And that way we have not only the resources under our feet in our soil, but we have the labour, the manpower, to be able to create armies strong enough to repel those kinds of attack. And so what those nations, what the Monrovia and the Brazzaville group then do is they vote things, they vote in policies that will ensure that Africa will never be united. And so, this idea of absolute sovereignty, can you imagine little Gambia? How can Gambia be sovereign? Tiny bit of land. Equatorial Guinea is even smaller. How can that be sovereign? It's just a fiction. But they pretended absolute sovereignty, and the fiction was to prevent other African nations from joining up with them. They were calling them absolute sovereign. But it didn't prevent the colonialists from going and eroding the so-called sovereignty whenever they chose to. The union, they also said that union must be voluntary. That when two states join together, they must do so on a voluntary basis. There can be no forcing of states to join together. That is a way of ensuring that even if you've just got one dissenting nation, or micronation I should really call it, even if you've got just one dissenting micronation, then you cannot have a united Africa. And of course, they had 28 dissenting nations, and so that was a massive block to a united Africa. And then they talked about non-interference, that one African nation should not interfere in the internal affairs of another African nation. But we saw very clearly that imperialism interferes. So imperialism went in and killed Patrice Lumumba, for instance, using the United Nations as its tool. And imperialism has never stopped interfering in these African micronations, but it tells African nations that they cannot interfere in each other's business. Well, of course, we're not talking about interference, we're talking about unity, which is something completely different when we're talking about African nations coming together. And then the other thing was that refugees cannot get asylum in a neighbouring country. In other words, if the government wants to kill you, you can't run and hide in another country. That that they make a pact to give you back so that the government can kill you. What kind of madness is that? Political asylum is just it's the natural order of the day if you are going to have separate states. Of course, we don't want separate states. Separate states are the medium that ensures that Africa doesn't unite. Anyone who supports the separation of states does not support the unification of Africa, is not a Pan-Africanist, and certainly is not a a socialist. Let me just finish this these few lines here of this section, which read: "Not only were the groups of African nations divided, but the agreement further ensured that each individual state would remain permanently divided from all of the others." You know, this is very, very significant. But what we'll do now, let's take a little break. I'm going to play a little bit of music. The music that I'm going to play is just to remind us of some of the things that are going on at the moment. They're deporting some of our people. The idea is that some of our people will be deported and sent to Jamaica tomorrow, even if they have no knowledge or next to no knowledge of Jamaica, on the grounds that they are not British and they've committed a criminal offence. So it's a topical issue at the moment, and what I'll do is I'll just play this tune to help us to remember that this issue is live right now.
Now this one dedicated to all the black money men of the world who don't proud to be black. Because black people in this world, we should be proud to be black. And I'm gonna tell you why. Hey, hey. Anything me say, wanna say, proud to be black. Anything me say, wanna say, proud to be black. Anything me say, wanna say, proud to be black. Anything me say, wanna say, proud to be black. Because proud to be black, proud to be black, 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 proud to be black, or I be proud to be black. Follow me now, proud to be black, proud to be black, 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 proud to be black, or I be proud to be black. Cause Marcus Garvey make me proud to be black, and Bob Marley make me proud to be black, and Nelson Mandela make me proud to be black, and Martin Luther King make me proud to be black. But you have some black people, them not proud to be black. When you ask them if them black, them will tell you see them brown. Them black race and culture, then try to disown. Some powder up their skin fi make it look like a town. Like me used to know this girl by the name of Joan, whose mother and father came from back home. She was blacker than Frank Bruno's dressing gown. She had the curly and she lip long down. But one thing about the girl, she was a nice looker. One of the nicest girl me said in the area. Say one day me say me go fi check her. Me say, hey darling, you really look super. Do you want to come to dance with me, the newsreader? She said, no thank you, I'm going out with Roger, and I only check guys who have white collar. Same night they went to pop club called Tropicana. Me say, she and the boy with them call Roger. And the door was two big bouncers. One looked like Big Daddy, the famous wrestler. Say Roger and John was about to enter when they heard the words from the biggest bouncer. He said, you can come in, mate, but not that nigga. We don't want this, so they troublemakers. The next day the girl come fi cry on me shoulder. Me tell her, move and go away, you should have proud of your color. Because proud to be black, proud to be
Crucial Rapid there, move and go away, you should be proud of your color. And then we're going to come back with the next style.
Oh yeah. Freedom and justice is what we want. Equality and love throughout the land. Respect my color, and I'll respect yours. Yours could never be superior to mine. Remember how we clean your mess. Don't you think we did our best? The job that we're doing for a small wage packet can get no promotion. Them calling us immigrants. No call us no immigrants. No call us no immigrants. We are West Indians. Call us no immigrants.
another way to amuse yourself. 'Cause what is joke to you is dead to me. I'm now color conscious, but I'm not ashamed. Even though you try to drive me insane, no longer will I accept your insults. Did I make myself clear? The job wouldn't be real. A small wage package can get no promotion. Them calling us immigrants. Oh yeah. Freedom and justice.
As we move into the dub section, don't call us no immigrants. Pat Kelly letting go some rhythm for us. We'll just let it run and then we'll come back with some literature afterwards.
Good job. First.
Yes, Pat Kelly, don't call us no immigrants. You know, you come here, we do all the worst jobs. You give us trouble even though we're doing work for you to make your country a better country. And then you don't even want to acknowledge us as citizens. And now what they're doing is they're sticking us on planes and sending us to beautiful parts of the world, agreed. But when you're sent somewhere involuntarily, this is an issue. This is an issue. This is a problem. And that's what they are doing at this time. So, continuing, we're now on section 3.6.4. entitled A Bankrupt OAU. OAU, by the way, stands for Organization of African Union. And the Organization of African Union came into existence in 1963. And what we're looking at, or we're just skating over actually, is the history that leads to the development of the Organization of African Unity and the dynamics that existed in that period. The dynamics that existed in that period is very important because we see what started off as an effort for unity under the leadership of Nkrumah turns into disunity as France, Britain and US Satan get their clutches into some parts of Africa and turn the leadership in those parts of Africa against African unity. And they do such a thorough job of it that they have the majority. And that majority then goes to form the Organization of African Unity. And of course, because the majority of leaders are actually really working for either France, US Satan or Britain, because that's their real agendas are working for those three, nothing that the Organization of African Unity does will genuinely be for African unity. So you've got an Organization for African Unity, or we had an Organization for African Unity that did not work genuinely for African unity. It worked for African division. And one of the ways that they worked for African division was to keep were really to keep the borders in place, to keep different parts of Africa separated from other parts of Africa. But let's read on. In 1963, Kwame Nkrumah wrote the book Africa Must Unite, in which he made a case for and explained the processes necessary for Africa's total liberation and unification. It was published just before the conference of the heads of state and governments held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And that conference ran from the 22nd to the 25th, of May 1963. Nkrumah saw this conference as a prelude to the setting up of an all-African socialist union government to end the various divisions amongst African states. It was at this conference that the Organization of African Unity was founded. The OAU was originally intended to bring strength, unity, and coordination to the African liberation process. But as a result of background intrigues of imperialism, it not only fell significantly short in practice, but actually opposed political union. One of the biggest stumbling blocks was the inclusion in the charter, which read, and I'm quoting it in section 8, it says, "To defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence." Those words are important. To defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, so-called independence, so-called territorial integrity, so-called sovereignty of these micro-nations. They were not protected from US Satan. They were not protected from France. US Satan and France have military bases on our soil. Britain too had military bases on our soil in Africa. What kind of sovereignty do you have when somebody else can put a military base on your soil? It's just complete nonsense. Territorial integrity. What kind of territorial integrity could you have when in practice what was happening is South Africa was sending their racists into various parts of the southern states and just killing people in villages. Just killing our people dead. Just in their villages minding their own business. And, what kind of independence can you have when the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the IMF are pinning down your economy, making sure you can't trade in a way that's advantageous to your people, making sure you're in colossal debt? How can you be genuinely independent in those circumstances? But those words were really they were inserted to keep African nations separate. So the European imperialist nations didn't observe this kind of stuff, but they created a situation where we were expected to observe it, and in fact, we made the mistake of actually doing that, not only putting it in, but observing it. This clause, the brainchild of imperialism, actually prevented the emergence of a continental state by enshrining the colonial borders created by European imperialists at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85. Now, before I move on, the Berlin Conference, which we haven't dealt with specifically here, it is very important to understand at least the basics of the Berlin Conference. What happened is from November 1884 to February 1885, a group of Europeans, and some Arabs too actually, sat in a room in Germany, in Berlin, Germany. The address of the house, I've been there, 77 Wilhelmstrasse is the actual address of the place where they sat down. And they sat down, they had a big table. It was inside a man's dining room. The man's dining room that they were in was a character called von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany at that point. And they sat down, and they had a big map of Africa. And to cut a long story short, they started to draw lines across the map of Africa. And then between them, they started to agree, okay, you can steal from that bit, and we'll steal from this bit. And you steal from that bit, and you lot can steal from that bit. And we'll steal from this bit, and you can steal from that bit. So what they did is they agreed stealing zones in Africa. And it was important for them to agree stealing zones because, you see, when they agreed stealing zones at that conference table, it meant that they knew in advance that they were not going to fight against each other for the riches of Africa. Remember, Africa is the richest continent in the world? So they were coming to steal that which was ours. They were coming to steal our riches. But if they didn't have a coordinated plan, they would end up fighting each other. So they sat down at this table for 3 months, drawing lines and agreeing who could steal from where, so that there would be no war between them. And they would do a coordinated invasion against our people, our ancestors, who were in Africa at the time. And so there was one part of Africa that was so rich that they didn't know what to do with it. That was the Congo. The Congo is the richest part of the richest continent in the world. Literally the richest part of the richest continent in the world. So they didn't know what to do with the Congo. And so what they did is they gave it to a character by the name of Leopold. They called him the King of Belgium. And they gave it to him as his personal property. They didn't even give it to him as, as Belgium. They gave it to him as his personal property. Yeah? And so he knew that, well, first of all, they knew that he was too weak to defend it. So anytime they want the Congo, they could just come give him 2 slaps and take it back. He knew that he was too weak to defend it. And so he instituted the most savage form of colonialism known to humanity. Literally, the most savage form of colonialism known to humanity. He was responsible for the genocidal murder of between 10 and there are estimates of up to 20 million people, African people, murdered by this maniac. He would actually chop off the hands and feet of African people, including children. Chopping off the feet of children, all these kinds of things. So if he sent you to go and get rubber and you didn't bring back enough money, he would either chop off your hands or your feet, or he would chop off the hands or feet or both of your children and send you back to get more under the threat that he'll chop off the hands and feet of the rest of your children. And in this way, he mutilated the population. He mutilated the population of the Congo, and they shared out Africa amongst themselves. There's a whole heap of history that I won't go into here, that I'm sure we'll have opportunities to go into other points in the future. But the essential point about the Berlin Conference is it was the conference where they, our enemy, our imperialist enemy, sat down and decided their plan of action. They decided their war against Africa. It was a war room. and it was a room. In that room, they were deciding not to war amongst themselves, but to do a coordinated war against African people. And the purpose of that war against African people was so that they could they could steal the wealth from our soil. So let me just go back and continue that again, having just given that little bit of an explanation. So this clause, the brainchild of imperialism, actually prevented the emergence of a continental state by enshrining the colonial borders created by European imperialists at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85. It was a bar on full political unity. Also, if the heads of state had voted for true political unity, they would have returned home no longer heads of state. Perhaps their self-interest had a part to play. Unfit for purpose, the OAU has become a puppet organization in the hands of neocolonialists and imperialists, and has neither the organizational material nor the will to conduct revolutionary war. The meagre and grudging efforts of the Liberation Committee of the OAU clearly shows this. Imperialists and neocolonialists and indigenous reactionary forces welcome platforms of protest such as the OAU. But action, not protest, is what is needed. Progressive forces the world over have seen the uselessness of non-violent protest and have begun to employ the use of force. So the OAU, which later transformed in 2002, it transformed into the AU and became equally useless as the African Union. It became a brake on the African liberation process, rather than speeding up the process, speeding up unity. It became a brake and installed division in the African continent. Now, the OAU was charged with having absolutely no perspective on Africa's fundamental neocolonial problem, precisely because it is a product of neocolonialism. The failure of the OAU simultaneously marked the futility of diplomatic initiatives aimed at continental unity. The only way to achieve true political unity is through armed struggle. But Nkrumah pointed out that, and I'm quoting Nkrumah here, he says, "Until guerrilla struggle in Africa is united and centralized, I can see no hope for total victory for the liberation forces. The OAU is as dead as a doornail." So if you think back now, what we had was a situation where when Ghana became independent, it set up two channels. It set up a governmental channel, which was a diplomatic front to try and win continental independence by peaceful means. That ended up being the OAU, and OAU was used to stall the process of African liberation. So now the only route remaining was the armed struggle route. So now only war could free the continent, because the OAU was actually a tool controlled by the enemy to prevent us from being liberated. And so we find ourselves in a serious contradiction, which Nkrumah says can now only be settled by war. So to continue. Undermined by Africa's developing neo-colonial class and their imperialist allies, the diplomatic route to unity and liberation descended into shambles. The shambles became total when Nkrumah was overthrown via a coup on the 26th of February, the 24th of February, 1966. Now, the CIA were involved in the overthrowing of Nkrumah. British were involved in the overthrowing of Nkrumah. The French were involved in the overthrowing of Nkrumah. We know that the latter was involved because one of the things that we're told is, and this is by a guy called John Stockwell. John Stockwell was the head of CIA operations in Africa. So he was in charge of CIA operations in Africa. And he tells us that, some of the planning for the coup happened next door in the Ivory Coast. So Ghana and the Ivory Coast border each other, they're next door to each other. And he was stationed in the Ivory Coast. He was not at that point the head of the CIA operations yet, but he was stationed in the Ivory Coast next door, and the Ivory Coast was being used as one of the bases for planning the coup against Nkrumah. The other thing that they did is they sent an African American in to be the ambassador for US Satan in Ghana, to make us think that he was our friend. And of course he was not our friend. He was working openly and covertly for the enemy. And so you had, one of the African Americans who was involved in organizing the coup against Nkrumah. So all kinds of insidious behaviors were being practiced at that time. Now, okay, we've come to the top of it. Let me just spin one more tune very quickly, just to give us an opportunity just to check on the next program.
All you lovely people in great measure, drinking rum and a coconut. There is something in your land, that no one can understand. There is something in your hill, or is it your mango tree? You have something there that takes my heart away. Inekanina, Imaru, we are Grenadians. Are you? Like a spice, when everything's ours. Grenadians, may God bless you. summertime.
all that time,
If you want a lovely beach,
anytime,
it's always within your reach.
all that time,
You have something there that takes a man again. In a Kanima, we are Grenadians who are you. Not a spice, where everything's nice. Grenadians, may God bless you. Antigua, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, Jamaica, oh, St. Lucia, St. Kitts. Good Lord, wait a minute. In this lovely paradise, you can watch the sunrise. Any evening, any day, you can have a sunset play. You can enjoy yourself forever and a day. In Ipanema, we are Grenadians who are you. On the skies where everything's nice, Grenadians, may God bless you. There are Grenadians everywhere, sons and daughters who pioneer, and they greet you with love and smile. Grenadians, may God bless you. Grenadians, may God bless you. Grenadians, may God bless you.
Grenadians, may God bless you. Oh boy. I would say Africans, may God bless you. So let's continue. I'll continue for a bit longer. We're going to be joined a little bit later by our brother Astamari. So I know some of you will be waiting. And what I'll do is I'll just share a little more. Let me just double check on this. In fact, it may make sense for me just to do a review. But anyway, not to worry. Section 3.7, entitled "Build a Socialist African Continental-Wide Nation-State Through Armed Struggle." And 3.71 is entitled "Armed Struggle as Contingency." I mean, certainly in the next week's program, we are going to be talking about the armed struggle phase of the revolution, and certainly Nkrumah, especially after the coup against him, became clearer on the need for an armed struggle phase. And remember that Garvey also spoke about armed struggle. You know, if we think back to the discussions that we had on Garvey, he spoke about armed struggle, but he spoke about armed struggle in the kinds of veiled terms. So he couldn't come straight out and say armed struggle. So he talked about shedding blood for our freedom and our liberty. You know, that's the kind of language that he used. He talked about liberty or death. And so Garvey was speaking in the terms of armed struggle, you know, in the 1920s. He was speaking in terms of, in fact, in the 1910s, because he was making some of these speeches in 1917, 18, and 19. Yeah, so he was speaking of armed struggle in those phases. And what then happens is when Nkrumah comes along, he says, look, let's give the diplomatic route a try. Yeah, let's give the diplomatic route a try. He gives the diplomatic route a try, only to find that that is undermined in a way that will ensure that the diplomatic route can't work. And so then he's left with only one alternative. He's left with the armed struggle alternative. And it is this that drives and guides the remainder of Nkrumah's strategy. It is this that we will be using or analysing more so next week as we discuss matters, discuss the remainder of Nkrumah's strategy next week. But just to recap, we've been looking at Nkrumah for the past couple of weeks now. We looked at his strategy going back to before he was the leader. So he was intimately involved in the 5th Pan-African Congress. The 5th Pan-African Congress was like a litmus paper which lit the torch of liberation of Africa. It was where we set out the broad plan for the liberation of Africa, and it would be followed by the independence of Africa. Nkrumah was there. Jomo Kenyatta was there. Hastings Banda was there. And many of the people who became the first generation of African leaders were at the 5th Pan-African Congress. And so that team of people then come back to Africa and move Africa forward in the direction of liberation. None more than Nkrumah, who does so well that he brings Ghana to the point where it can begin to help other nations. Now, in Ghana, what Nkrumah then does is he follows a what we could call a peaceful route to securing Ghana, to winning control of that part of our motherland. Now, whilst he is being peaceful, the enemy is not being peaceful. They're killing us. They're killing us in our hundreds. But he, like Martin Luther King, well, Martin Luther King actually copied Nkrumah, yeah. He is not fighting back militarily. He's using moral persuasion. And that moral persuasion in the form of what was called positive action wins the day, and eventually, after lots and lots of struggles, compromises where he's got the enemy inside his government before he can eject them, etc., etc. There was a period where he had, 3 ministers in his government appointed by Britain, Europeans. One controlling finance, one controlling defence, one controlling foreign affairs. What kind of a government do you have when your Chancellor of the Exchequer is controlled by your enemy? When your military foreign affairs is controlled by your enemy, your defence, your military is controlled by the enemy. When your when your foreign affairs are controlled by the enemy, you can't even speak to other nations except through your enemy. So they had Nkrumah's government under lockdown. But anyway, he maneuvered his way through that, and eventually, by 1957, Ghana became independent. And Nkrumah moved from being the first minister at one point to being the prime minister at another point to, in 6th of March 1957, becoming the president of Ghana with control. He then uses that not only to build Ghana, which he did more effectively than any other leader in Africa. Ghana became by far the most developed nation in Africa under Nkrumah. By miles. It wasn't even close, just by miles. Yeah. But in addition to that, he's also working on uniting the whole of the African continent. So part one of his strategy is the securing of Ghana. And part two of his strategy is the securing of the African continent. And so this is where we've reached now. And then what happens is when he tries to secure the African continent, the imperialists then start to organize themselves so that they can have puppets in place who they can use to block the initiatives that Nkrumah is putting forward. And so they then work out how to get their people in place through assassination, through coups, through the explosion of nuclear weapons on our soil, etc., etc., and all kinds of bullying and intimidation tactics they actually use. And then they organize it so that they have the majority of African leaders are actually beholden to them. That's the way that they did it. And so because they had the majority of African leaders in their camp, they could prevent genuine African liberation from taking place via the diplomatic route. And so Nkrumah reaches the point now where, having looked at two options, the diplomatic route, which was used in Ghana, and when it came to the continent, diplomatic route didn't work. He had started the freedom fighters route, but didn't pursue it because he was looking for the diplomatic route. He now, when the diplomatic route fails for the continent, he now comes back and he says, okay, we've got no choice. We have to engage in armed struggle. Incidentally, when you hear Malcolm X say, he talks about violence and he talks about by any means necessary, this comes from Nkrumah. You know, people think of it as Malcolm X, but that actually comes from Nkrumah, the by any means necessary. Yeah, and so what then happens is, because diplomatic route is blocked, Africa is left with no choice but to go the route of armed struggle. And when we resume next week, we will, we will look at the armed struggle element of Nkrumah's strategy. So it's very important that we, stay tuned. Stay tuned next week. Now, I just want to bring in my brother Astamari, who's waiting so patiently. My brother, I thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, beloved.
I just want to bring you in.
No, beloved Amawale, it's patience. It's such an honor to hear the show, to hear the deep historical language you are speaking, the wisdom, the insight on the mighty Marcus Garvey. Oh, this thing here is a high level of study that you are delivering to the ones. We give thanks.
Oh, those are very, very kind words,
and
my brother.
These are the
very
times
kind
we
words.
need the revolutionary learning. We need it. Things are going on in the world, and we have to remember the historical context.
Yes, truly.
We have to respect the work of the great warriors of the past.
Mm-hmm. Truly.
If we don't have ones like you who can retell the story in a proper form, what's going to happen? So we give thanks to you.
Thank you, my brother. And we can look forward to our brother Astamari is in the wings, ready to come in straight after. So if you're waiting for our brother, have no fear. He is here, and he will be with you in, very shortly.
Give thanks.
Very
Give
shortly.
thanks. Hashima, give thanks. Respect to you and all ones. Give thanks.
Love and respect to you, my brother. So it's just for me to close the program for today, and I just want to say a big thank you to all to all of the people that listen to the program this evening. Yeah, a big thank you to all of the people that listen to the program this evening. I want to say a big thank you to my fellow presenters, of course, my brother Astamari, who's here, but the rest of my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio. I want to say a big thank you to the engineers for the work that they are doing consistently in the background. We must never take the work of the engineers for granted. We thank you greatly for your work, engineers. We thank you greatly. We also thank greatly the station's management. They provide the infrastructure for us to be able to communicate with each other in this way. So thank you to the station's management. But most of all, I want to say thank you to our ancestors, without whom none of us would be here today. My name is Brother Omowale, and I bid you a good evening and look forward to joining you same time next week between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on Monday evening. Love and respect to you all.
Wasi yola bola ngani na, wasi yedi